provide better care at lower cost. That's it. Pretty simple, right? And it should be pretty easy to do because healthcare around the world is the best it's ever been, whether that's in the United States, Argentina, or anywhere else. But when we look at the results, it's actually been really hard to do. And acceptance of the electronic medical record from the medical community has been poor at best. And we can see in these quotes some of that feedback, primitive and asinine, what real doctors think of the electronic medical records. Nearly 80% of physicians say the EMR is not worth the cost. 9 reasons doctors hate their EMR. Just 9? I could probably come up with 10 if they really wanted it. So why is that? Well, the Rand Corporation went back and studied it again. And what they found was that the disappointing performance of health information technology could be attributed to 3 things. Sluggish adoption of health IT systems. So that's healthcare's fault. Change is hard to do. Systems that are neither interoperable nor easy to use, and that's the software company's fault. Just need to create better software. And failure of healthcare providers and institutions to re-engineer the care processes to reap the full benefit of health IT. And that's the clinician's fault, our fault for not being an active part and taking an active part in the change. But really, none of that should have surprised anyone because there's this thing called the productivity paradox. Whenever you introduce new technology to an industry, any industry, productivity and satisfaction falls. And when it involves information technology, this change typically takes about 5 to 15 years to adjust. So you see a fall in productivity and satisfaction for at least 5 to 15 years. We saw it with banking in the 1970s. We saw it with hotels and airlines in the 80s and 90s. And just like the second Rand study showed us, the productivity is at work in health information technology because it's typically 3 things that affect the productivity paradox. And one is users, healthcare in general, are slow to adopt the technology. It's hard. Nobody wants to change no matter what that change is, or it's hard to change. The systems that are immature and buggy. So when the productivity paradox is in play, it takes time for these new systems to actually work the kinks out, to improve, to understand the workflow, get to the point where everybody's working at peak productivity. And then thirdly, those definitions and the processes of healthcare and healthcare productivity change when we digitize the system. And clinicians need to be a part of those discussions and understand that change and it's how it's going to affect their patterns of practice. In the US, we're only 10 years in, and I think it will probably take longer than the usual 5 to 15 years, probably. But again, that shouldn't surprise anyone because change is hard, and healthcare is a very conservative industry. And medicine is slow to adopt change. We like to think in medicine that we're agents of change. Take this medication, lose weight, exercise, do this, don't do that, but we're actually terrible at change ourselves, and we're terrible at taking our own advice. It takes 17 years for most clinicians to incorporate new medical knowledge into their clinical practice. No one wants to be the first to use new therapy, and no one wants to be the last to use a new therapy. And that's as true today as it ever was. Change is hard, and the impact of culture makes it harder. And the changes that are being made in healthcare as we digitize it, and the changes we're asking our clinicians to go through can be even harder. They're career-changing patterns of work. There are lots of different thoughts on what change management is, and consulting firms make millions of dollars in pesos every year managing this. And here are a lot of definitions, or a few definitions of change. I'm not going to read them all, and I don't expect you to read it either. But let me summarize what they all have in common. They're all about a systematic process of transitioning people from one thing to the next. Or how do I get people to move from point A to point B and make it stick? I drive a Mini Cooper. I love my car. It's small, it's fast, it's nimble. It's like a little race car. It is so much fun to drive. But Mini Coopers have terrible tires. My tires wore out before the car was even 9 months old. Terrible. My wife, however, would tell you that the tires in the car are just fine. The problem isn't the tires. The problem is me and the way I drive, which is as fast as I can, screeching through curves, sliding into parking spots. The rest of you on the road better get out of my way. She'd say, no, the tires are great. It's the idiot driving the car. And as much as I don't want to admit that, she's probably right. I'm a terrible driver, maybe even dangerous. And this is where people get confused, because change control is not change management. They're not the same things. So let's look at that. Here's a medical example, since we're all in healthcare. You have high blood pressure, 162 over 108. That's pretty high. So I want to treat you. I put you on lisinopril, a little blue pill, and I say come back in a month. And when you come back in a month, hopefully your blood pressure got better. Should have, but for some reason it didn't. It's still pretty high, 162 over 108 yet again. So I say, well, let's try you on a new pill, metoprolol, a little pink pill. Now, it might work, but in your case, it probably doesn't work, because in fact, you look like this guy. And all the little pink and all the little blue pills and all the world aren't going to make a difference in your blood pressure until you get off your lazy rear end, stop eating cheeseburgers and salty snacks, start exercising and living a healthy lifestyle. Because change control is about things. It's technical. Change management is about people. Change control is get new tires, take a different pill. Change management is changing the way I drive. It's losing weight. It's hard to do. I don't want to lose weight. I like eating cheeseburgers. Why would I do that? I don't have a driving problem. Everybody else does. They should get out of my way. Change control, change management are different. Change management focuses on people and adaptive changes. Technical problems are easy to identify. There's usually a quick solution. Here, take this pill, buy new tires. People are generally receptive. It's about things. Adaptive problems, however, are difficult to identify. They change our values, our beliefs, our roles, and our relationships. And you have to solve it yourself. And people resist that. I can switch out the pill, but I can't just as easily switch out the behavior. And the single biggest failure is to treat adaptive challenges like technical problems. Let's just keep buying new tires, or let's just try the green pill. You can't just throw technology at the problem, because you're changing who they are, what they do, and how they practice medicine. And everyone says they want to change, but when asked, or everybody says they want change, they don't want to change themselves. That's a different thing. And it's not really the change, it's the transition. It's not always that we don't want to change, or that we're afraid or in love with the old ways. It's just that place in between. That transition is hard. That process of losing weight, it's hard and sometimes painful, maybe even a little bit bloody. It's that change, that transitional time between the old ways and the new. That's what we really fear. Change, again, can be easy and fast. It can be an event or situation. Flip the light switch and the lights come on. Change. Transition, though, is a difficult and slow psychological process. of accepting and adapting the new ways. So maybe a better name for change management really should be transition management. So how do we design our health information technology, electronic medical record solutions to take our users through that transition, the change in practice, how they've been doing it for their whole career? Well, first we have to make an effort to understand what we're asking of people. And part of that is to understand that workflow is not a word in the physician's vocabulary. If you ask a clinician what's their workflow, they'll kind of give you a dumb look and say, well, I don't know. Patient just comes in and I take care of them. You know, they tell me stuff and I give them medication and everything. They go home and they're happy and they get better. It's hard to explain. But we all know there's a process behind it. There's lots of little steps along the way. And there are people who are really good at mapping out those processes, all those little steps. But what we're not so good at understanding is that inner workflow. When I go in to see a patient, what is that inner monologue going through my head? What's my actual subconscious organic workflow? That thing that I can't explain. So let me give you an example of how we got it wrong and then fixed it. This is a standard outpatient prenatal form. Every obstetrician in America has used this or some version very similar to it for the last 70 or 80 years. When taking it digital, we made an effort to redesign this workflow to make it more meaningful, more accessible, and more usable. And the design we came up with was this. And when we showed it, everybody said, wow, that's really cool. It's pleasing to look at, has all the functionality of the old form. Doctors are gonna love this, right? And when we put it out there, the doctors hated it, absolutely hated it. And why was that? Well, I think the reason is that when we were designing the new digital workflow, we only thought about the end process, what we wanted it to be at the end. But what we failed to show was empathy for the change we were asking the doctors and nurses to make. We failed to show familiarity with the workflow they were used to. And we failed to show respect for those users and how they want it to work. 2 years later, we built this. It's a little different, kind of looks like the old paper workflow. Similar. We didn't scrap the new designs. We didn't throw out the new designs. But what we did was we made them an option. And then we gave the users a bridge through that transition, a hand to help them make it across. I recently talked with the chief medical information officer of a large maternity service. 75% of his doctors are actually using the new workflow now. But what they needed to get there to see the value in it was they needed that bridge of that intermediate workflow. They needed that flow sheet view. 25% of his users still haven't made the change yet, some that probably never will. But for most of them, they just needed a helping hand to get them across. And now they see the value in the new design way. Skeuomorphism is the design concept of making the items represented resemble their real-world counterparts. And it's a bad word among software designers and designers in general. They hate it. But skeuomorphism brings familiarity, and familiarity is the key concept for helping users in making the transition. Skeuomorphism can be the agent for that transition. Skeuomorphism has been used effectively and not very effectively throughout the years. An absolutely spectacular failure of skeuomorphism back in the 1990s was the Microsoft Bob operating system. And if it doesn't look familiar, count yourself lucky, because it was the worst operating system ever. It was just awful, just plain awful, terrible. And fortunately, it died a very quick death, never to be seen again until I created this slide. But skeuomorphism can also be really helpful in moving users through the transition. Steve Jobs knew this. And when Apple introduced the iPad, they used it very effectively to help transition users away from the old ways to the new digital metaphor. A calendar that looks like a calendar. It's a bridge of familiarity. And if you want people to read books on the new device, make the bookshelf look like an actual bookshelf to build that familiarity. But I think you also need to realize over time that skeuomorphism becomes just visual noise. It becomes trite, it becomes a trope. The transition stage passes and users move on, and they actually want and need cleaner and faster paradigms and ways of doing things. So eventually we outgrow skeuomorphism. But in healthcare, we can use that same process, whether it's building familiarity in a maternity workflow, or in this, an example of a standard paper ordering form, and a digital version to walk users through the transition of ordering things in a digital environment in the electronic medical record. And that's all a part of planning the change and controlling the experience. And to do that, we need to go back to understanding the inner workflow and the needs of the user for when they're novices, new to the software, and when they're expert users. In healthcare, there's a level of necessary complexity. Here's a standard intensive care unit flow sheet. It's dense, it's data-driven, it's complex. Everything you need to know about the physiologic state of the patient is recorded on this form. There's a lot going on there. But in the digital realm, we have the capability of increasing the amount of data that we capture by an order of magnitude. And it's easy for new users to get lost in all that data and how it's presented. So we need to simplify that complexity for the new user to help them find the patterns of care. So here's a simple example of what could be a novice interface. A third-year medical student should be able to glance at this and know that the diagnosis is diabetic ketoacidosis. We clearly show the laboratory values in context of each other to simplify the cognitive impact without the users having to read the actual numeric values or even know what those normal ranges are. But we also need an expert interface to let the expert user experience the complexity and use their own cognitive processes to navigate that complexity, but still guide them to the patterns of care they're looking for to give them clarity within the complexity and see the diagnosis of diabetic ketoacidosis. We build a bridge to transition the user from the novice to the expert. And the complexity is neither created nor destroyed, but it's transferred. It's transferred to the skill level of the user to simplify and return the necessary complexity. As part of all this, though, you need to measure the change, and then you need to measure it again so you can factor learning into that process. In design, learning across the transition. Medical software is complex, and though it's focused on safety, it still has the possibility of being unsafe in unfamiliar hands. Learning and training is still key to the safe operation of the electronic medical record. We don't let medical students operate alone on patients for good reason, nor should we let clinicians use the EMR without proper knowledge. When we look at training, the increase in skill or knowledge of how to use the system may increase rapidly to its maximum rate during the initial attempts, but it usually gradually levels out and may even stop. So we need to evolve our learning experiences to support the users across that transition. And those learning experiences need to be both experiential and iterative. They need to relate to the experience of using the system, and they need to be continuous through the whole process of learning and continuing to use the system. Learning experiences that aid the transition from the initial setup and training of the new users, including tutorials, walkthroughs, practice environments to get ready, and then coaching marks, in-app help, and maybe even at the shoulder or at the elbow help from real live people to support us when we get lost or unsure of what to do next. And then continued support as we introduce new features, new workflows, and new experiences and how the system evolves over time. Satya Nadella would tell you that empathy is key to, and Satya Nadella is the CEO of Microsoft, and he'd tell you that empathy is key to modern software development. And I might say it's familiarity with your users and their inner workflow. And designers would say it's all about emotion. And the author David Hinman would tell you to always respect your user. But I think there's a key concept that wraps that all up and is core to what we do. Development that fails to always keep humanity in its sights is destined to failure. That's the key concept that wraps up all this technical and adaptive and empathy and respect and all that. It's the humanity the designers, the architects, and the engineers can bring to their health information technology solutions. It's the recognition of the humanity in those who use those solutions or are the beneficiaries of those who use the solutions, the patients. It's our job as the software designers and engineers to get that right for all of them. And with that, I would once again like to thank you for inviting me back to be part of your symposium this year. I miss Buenos Aires. I hope all of you stay safe throughout the next year. And thank you again.